Today we're going to build these subtle yet hugely over-the-top coffee and end tables. What they're made of is almost a whole poplar tree and over 100 pounds of metal. They're pretty heavy. This project is really a story of two tables. The coffee table is 4-inch thick, so I ran into quite a bit of problems with my tools not being able to handle that width. The end tables are only 3 inches thick, so they were much easier. After planing down the slabs for the coffee table, I got them into an orientation that I thought looked best. When you're doing this, make sure that the end grain is alternating or you're going to get some serious warping. Because my table saw was not thick enough to get through these boards, I had to use my hand plane to flush everything up for the glue up. This took many hours. Essentially, you try and get everything as square and flat as possible and then start to mate the two pieces together. This was actually quite satisfying even though it took so long, but looking back I probably could have started by getting a better starting edge using my table saw or my track saw to do so. Here I'm using my flashlight to try and get an idea about where the cracks are in the boards. It takes a lot of trial and error, but eventually I was able to get it to a point where it was pretty flush and I was confident that the glue would fill any extra cracks. Once that was done, I marked out the spots for biscuits, then went about cutting the slots on the top and bottom of the boards since they were pretty thick and I didn't want things to slide. After I did a dry fit, I applied a very liberal amount of wood glue so that it would fill any imperfections. I applied the glue with an ink roller that I got recently and this worked out really well. Then I clamped things up and let it dry. Once it dried, I used a chisel to remove the excess glue. I also found that it's a really good idea to put your good side down when you're doing a glue up because the glue drips out the bottom, and then that way you ensure that there's enough there to fill any cracks. The top of this glue up, which was facing up, didn't look nearly as good as the bottom. In this case it was okay, I just flipped things over and the old bottom became the new top. Then I used my hand plane to even everything out. This took quite a while since there was a tiny bit of warping in some of the wood. It's these small things that really take up a lot of time when you're working with a limited number of tools. If I had a nice big joiner and planer, this project would have been a breeze. It also would have been really boring to watch, but that's a different point. I filled a couple cracks on the bottom that aren't going to be seen anyway with some wood putty. This build also was challenging just due to its scale. The tabletop alone probably weighs 100 or so pounds, which made it difficult to work on alone. I had initially cut the first pass with my track saw inside, but this was a little too dusty, so we brought everything outside and I traced the line up to make the cut on the opposite side. I will say that I'm pretty impressed with how well the Kreg track saw melts through this huge slab. You just need to take your time since the blade had so many teeth. After cutting everything on one side, we flipped the table over, which again took a bit of effort, and finished up all the cuts on the other side. I'm going to attach these awesome 1/4 inch thick steel legs with bolts. In order to do that, I had to countersink the threaded inserts first. So we spaced the legs an inch from the ends and marked all the slot locations. Turned out that some of the pre-cut slots were actually a little too small for the bolts that I bought, so Matt used a rasp to open them up a little bit. While he was doing that, I drilled the holes for the threaded inserts. The top has a hole in it that needs to be filled, so I'm going to use Total Boat epoxy to fill it. I'm mixing it with some charcoal so the color will match the stain that we're using. I really want to thank Total Boat for sponsoring this video. This is my first time using epoxy or anything like this, honestly, and it was a breeze. I'll include a link to the epoxy I'm using here as well as in the description. I also actually have a couple other ideas for larger builds that highlight the epoxy a little bit more, so expect those in the future sometime. Anyway, back to the build. This hole took a surprising amount of epoxy to fill. Despite looking quite small, there must be a large cavern inside the wood. I just kept adding more pores, vibrating the wood to let any bubbles come to the surface, and rinse and repeat. Eventually, it filled everything up. Once it cured, I used my hand plane to remove the excess epoxy. This actually took a little while because the epoxy is so hard, but eventually it got to a point where it looked really good, and a little bit of sanding made it perfectly flush. I also cleaned up the edges, which had a little bit of a lip on them from cutting them down. Alright, on to the end tables. These were much faster thanks to their size, although I did run into some problems from the start. The wood I was using was pretty warped, as you can see, so I decided to make a sled using 3/4 inch plywood. I laminated 2 pieces together, and then I added a lip and I used some sandpaper tape to hold things in place. All you do is shim under the slab to keep it level, and then run it through the planer, and the lip will keep everything in place. Once I had one flat side, I could get rid of the sled and just run the board through by itself flipped over. You can see here how it has 2 high corners, which eventually I was able to get down and had everything nice and parallel. Next, I cut everything down to width on my table saw. This board was a bit cupped on one side, so I used a straight piece that I had cut already as a reference. Then once I ran it through the first time, I could use the newly cut side as the new reference and run it through normally. After I had my boards orientated how I wanted them, again make sure that the end grain alternates so you can avoid warping, I made another set of cuts to clean everything up. As you can see on my very scientific drawings here, you flip the left board over and run it through the table saw in the same orientation as the right board. Then, when you flip it back, the 2 cuts will mate and mitigate any slight variation in the board angle. I didn't use any biscuits because these tables are small enough that I can run them through the planer once they dry. Even though the edges mated much better than on the big table, I still used a whole bunch of glue to ensure that there were no cracks. After the glue set, I used my table saw to cut things down to width, taking a little bit off of each side. Then I did a final run through the planer to get everything perfectly flush. I filled a couple of small cracks on the bottom with wood putty, and then I used my speed square to mark out where I was going to cut the ends down. I started by using my track saw, but after I realized the boards would actually fit on my table saw using my miter sled, I switched to that because it was going to be way easier. I could do just one cut. Then I did a whole bunch of sanding, and I took everything from about 60 grit all the way down to 220 grit. I applied a coat of ebony black stain to all 3 slabs. Then I finished them with about 4 coats of water-based poly using my finish sprayer. I sanded before the final coat to make sure everything was really nice and smooth. For this build, I'm using legs I got from Sanka's Custom Rustics, who sponsored this video. These things are a 1/4 inch thick steel and rock solid. I could probably drive my car over them. I'll link to the store in the description of this video if you're interested. I used some mineral spirits to clean up the legs before I applied a matte coat to everything. Once that was done, I drilled the holes for the threaded inserts in the end tables, and I screwed those in. This requires a little bit of elbow grease, but having a nice set of Allen wrenches is really helpful. I'll link to the ones I have below. And then I bolted on the legs. I was really impressed with how well the hardware worked. I'll link to the stuff I used in the description below if you're interested. Also, I forgot to mention, the legs come with these nice slots cut in, so it accounts for wood movement. Finally, I added some felt feet to protect the floor, as these legs are pretty sharp, and everything was done. I love how these tables turned out. I made these for my buddy Matt, who's all about overbuilding. The tables have an interesting brutalist feel to them, which is contrasted with the clear care and attention to detail that went into their creation. In the right light, the tops actually look like they could be hollow, like from IKEA or something, but then you push them with your foot and you realize they weigh about 200 pounds. I also love the contrast between the texture of the legs and the wood, as well as the completely different feel you get when you look at these from the side or the front. Thanks again to TotalBoat and Sanka's Custom Rustics for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching. Hit the thumbs up and subscribe to see more content, and I'll see you in the next episode.